talk about common logical fallacies. We've all had discussions in the past where either we or the other person was being illogical. Perhaps when we are caught up in a passionate difference of opinion, we can resort to distracting perspectives that can feel correct, but are not really reliable for the purpose of compelling anyone to change their thinking. Nobody can completely avoid these pitfalls without first learning to spot them. And even when we have been trained to spot them, these obstacles to productively discussing ideas are not fully perfected by anyone. We can get better at it, but we never get to the point that we are above it all. It will probably always be true that it will be easier for us to spot fallacies and errors in the arguments of others, while it remains more difficult for us to spot them in our own opinions. Well, consequently, we benefit most from the understanding of logical fallacies by having friends who are also clearly able to understand these fallacies, who also have the kind of relationship with us that, they can point out to us when we have resorted to bad form. This, of course, requires that both of you in such a relationship correctly understand these fallacies, and it probably helps if you both have workable differences of opinion. I'm Bob Greaves, and this is an audio edition from my YouTube channel, Living with Wisdom. Perhaps the best way to understand logical fallacies requires understanding first what all logical fallacies have in common. Otherwise, the list of logical fallacies might just seem like a disconnected list of things that people who like to debate and argue have simply arbitrarily decided to call logical fallacies. Moreover, it is not as if all logical gaffes fit neatly into a textbook example. So a list of fallacies is not necessarily complete nor precise when applied to a deliberated issue. So, what do all logical fallacies have in common? Well, obviously, they have in common that they are all allegedly illogical. But before addressing the negative approach, let us start with a positive approach. What makes an opinion, a perspective, an argument, or an assertion logical? A statement is logical when that opinion, perspective, argument, or assertion can rationally stand on its own merits. And to be more exact, what must stand are the rationality of the premise, of any steps or methodologies relied upon to reach a conclusion, and the conclusion reached by those steps or methods. Consequently, what all logical fallacies have in common is that they are a way of attempting to either uphold or tear down an opinion, a perspective, an argument, or assertion for reasons that actually have nothing to do with the relevant merits or demerits of the premise, the steps, methodologies, or the conclusion reached. However, keep in mind that these fallacies do not necessarily debunk the argument. They are simply irrelevant to the argument. So it remains that the use of logical fallacies is never proof that someone is wrong, only that, if they are correct, it is not for the reasons they have put on offer. So let us take a look at several common mistakes and clarify what they do and do not mean. Hopefully, we will more clearly see how they are not actually relevant or sufficient to the merits or demerits of a particular point of view. I need to stress at the start, however, that beginners too often jump at the form of an alleged mistake because they fail to distinguish a logical fallacy from an attending remark. Just because some statement takes the form of a fallacy or error does not mean anything if the statement taking that form is merely an attending remark. These alleged errors of clarity in thought are only errors when they are relied upon as the substantive, compelling rationale. As I address these various pitfalls, I have them somewhat in alphabetical order based on the classification I found useful. It is not as if these classifications could not go by some other term and thus appear in some other order. I begin with ad hominem. An ad hominem involves attacking some quality about a person as if that particular characteristic is sufficient to debunk their thinking. However, this is not to say that something about a person does not have any relevance in explaining why their thinking might be invalid. Consequently, just because something negative about a person is mentioned does not mean that an ad hominem is on offer. It is only an ad hominem when the attack on that person forms the basis for rejecting their idea. Ideas stand or fall entirely on their own, irrespective of whose idea they are or what might be that person's character. And very often, when somebody does subscribe to an invalid idea, there very well may be something significant in their history that can help explain how they came to embrace such a false notion. But this remains merely biographically interesting. Furthermore, attacking a person's character or history is not an ad hominem fallacy when your point is to attack the person or their history, so long as you're not claiming that somehow this is sufficient cause to also invalidate their ideas. White people can understand racism. Wealthy people can understand poverty. An uneducated person might have a brilliant idea. Men can have something useful to say about feminism. Criminals might have noble intentions. Habitual liars will at times tell the truth, and a member of a political party or membership in a certain cult does not mean that person cannot ever think clearly or objectively. However, when someone does have an invalid idea, these personal attacks could help us to understand how that came about, and there is nothing wrong with entertaining the possibility that a person's background and history could warrant taking a closer look at a possible bias in their expressed assertions. However, this too can be our own triggered bias running wild. In the end, all arguments require a sufficiently close consideration apart from the features of the person who puts that argument on offer. Nonetheless, regardless of what significant or even uncomplimentary fact we might assign to someone, that has absolutely no bearing on if their ideas do or do not have independent merit. Ideas still stand or fall entirely on their own. Ad nauseum. I've been accused of this often, and it has probably been true more often than I like to admit. It can be an irksome experience. This is when someone repeats themselves over and over and over again as if they are offering additional information. Now, sometimes this is an honest mistake. When we get a puzzled look from others, we might wonder if what we just said was not understandable, and so we strive to find a different way of saying the same thing. That is an attempt at effective communication. However, it does not help if a person understands our statement but returns a puzzled look because they are taken aback at how we could say something so silly, only to follow that up by saying it again in some other way. And so that puzzled look might seduce us into an ad nauseum repetition. Or more likely, we have unwarranted hope against all hope that we might be able to prevail on what we cannot admit is an unworkable argument. We might not be aware that our multiplicity of talking points are simply regurgitations. Unfortunately, this is an obsessive personality flaw for some people. Appeal to authority. The appeal to authority works in two ways. One, if we require an authority figure before we can accept something, and two, expecting someone else to accept something simply because an authority figure is of that opinion. Now, this is not to knock the fact that there are people who really are experts, nor is it to suggest that an authority figure is no more likely than a non-authority figure to be correct. Nonetheless, consensus can at times be more political than scientific. This may or may not be the rule, but it does happen. Authorities and experts do not always agree. They might be better prepared to argue for their opinion with a barrage of deeply considered reasons, but they can still be wrong. Although it is less common, it does happen that people with no formal credentials, little experience, and of no reputation uncover serious problems with expert consensus, or come up with a brilliant solution to a long-standing problem all the so-called experts have overlooked. So, having experts in various disciplines is absolutely valuable, and there's no justification for glibly rejecting or accepting an authority, or for glibly rejecting a person of no reputation. But, as Tom Nichols points out in his book, The Death of Expertise, we are currently at a low ebb in our culture where we too easily reject credible expertise and think of ourselves as comparable or even superior experts over questions we have strong opinions about, even though we lack the background. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a problem in every culture, but I agree with Tom Nichols that this seems to be more pronounced these days. I found it interesting that Albert Einstein was originally regarded as a kook and could not get a job as a professor of physics, which is why he became a patent clerk. Yes, the odds are usually with the acknowledged experts, but regardless of where the authoritative odds are best, this has no bearing in the final analysis as to if an idea is to be assumed correct or incorrect. In the end, as we said before, ideas stand or fall entirely on their own. In our American court system, I believe this is a huge problem. Juries and judges will often hear testimony from expert witnesses on both sides of the courtroom. Experts apparently dealing with the exact same data and analysis nevertheless explain different conclusions to a jury of non-experts. The jury is likely without the personal competence to determine which expert might be fudging the facts, or if the issue is reasonably debatable. And most lawyers do not want experts in the jury because the experts tend to take too much control over the other jurors during deliberation. But furthermore, a jury made up of experts is not necessarily a jury of one's peers. Unfortunately, expert witnesses are most often people who are paid to be a witness for one side or the other in a courtroom dispute, and so they have a built-in conflict of interest. I do not have a simple solution to this courtroom problem, but it is at times beyond obvious when witnessing a court case being argued that experts are occasionally resorting to ridiculous extremes. Appeal to ignorance. There are things we do not know and even things we cannot know. Consequently, we cannot require acceptance or rejection of an idea that cannot be proven or disproven. It cannot be argued that there's no way you could know that, so you must be wrong. Nope. People can, out of sheer dumb luck, be absolutely correct about their suspicions, even though they have no way to compellingly prove it. Furthermore, none of us can determine if they are right or wrong. Maybe they are, maybe they're not. Technically, they cannot claim they know anything, but they can still be warranted in embracing a suspicion or belief. And maybe someday they will be vindicated. But in the meantime, we can still be warranted in having serious doubts. For example, if you're talking to a salesperson and you get the impression that they're not entirely forthright, it could be that they are disorganized in how they explain their excellent product. Or it could be they are scamming you. If you cannot figure out for yourself the reliability of the product or of the salesperson, you need not be able to prove you are being scammed before you decide you're not confident in the deal. And you are fully warranted in deciding to back away. Ignorance cannot justify certainty, but it can warrant caution. And sadly, it can justify abandoning an idea that is actually a reflection of truth. In my opinion, this logical fallacy is behind both sides of the God debate. Is there a God? Many atheists strongly assert that a person needs justification for God beliefs. All too often, they claim this is scientific. But scientific methods only apply in situations where we actually have something that can be measurably examined using some peer-reviewed methodology to examine it. Now, to date, no one has developed one single scientific method for determining if any gods are measurably present or absent. This is, therefore, not a scientific question. Science cannot help us or even guide us. There either is or is not a God, and if there is a God, there's no way to know what it is that makes that God the God that it is. We actually know nothing about it. In fact, all religions and all God notions are completely irrelevant to the question of if there is a God. Certainly, we can be critical of certain God notions. Theology can often be demonstrably absurd. But since this is an area where we are all, believer and unbeliever, absolutely ignorant, indisputable problems with certain God notions nonetheless have no bearing on the question of God's existence itself. It is entirely possible that there is a God and that all God notions and all religions are nothing more than completely ridiculous attempts to pretend to know something about it. God notions, no matter how brilliant or silly, are irrelevant to the question of if there is a God. If people believe there is something, or if people believe there is nothing, this probably says something about them. However, what it says about them is also completely unknown. We do not know what it says about them. As I see it, the God debate is totally useless on both sides, and people might be fully warranted to find themselves wherever they may. When it comes to believing in God, those that do, no doubt, find it impossible to do so without attaching some sort of a theological framework, resulting in some sort of organized belief system. But this is psychologically involuntary. Beliefs are not knowledge claims, and it is conflation to require that beliefs pass the same standard as knowledge. So, it is not surprising that in our total ignorance on the matter that so many variations on God notions have come about. Given our total ignorance over any measurable, relevant details, numerous God notions are exactly what we should expect. No compelling surprise here to explain a myriad of religions or denominations. And people can believe in God for a wide variety of different causes. It is not as if they are all cohorts in an identical mass delusion. Maybe some people who believe in God do so for mere cultural reasons. Maybe some people are sensitive to some presence that others are not. If so, how can we who are not sensitive to that presence claim they are not? Maybe those who do sense something divine then go about in response to just make stuff up or latch on to familiar theological ideas around them as best they can. Maybe some causes are more warrantable than others. Who knows if there is or is not a God? No one. So believe or don't. Be free and unencumbered with a false need to comply with the opinions of others on this matter. We are all ignorant. It is true that there are things we truly do not know and cannot explain or articulate, but that does not mean they are by default either true or false. In such cases, the truth exists, or should I say, something is the case, but it is only the verifiability that does not exist. And all guesses have a place at the discussion table unless there is something about that particular guess that also relies on some feature that is verifiably false. In the end, ignorance leaves us unable to know if there are any actual merits or demerits, and so ignorance cannot be appealed to for either proving or debunking. Ignorance can certainly properly refuse the demand we be compelled, but it can also properly refuse the demand that we abandon our beliefs. So this fallacy involves attempting to reach a compelling conclusion where that is impossible. And the fact that beliefs arise in matters where all sides are equally in ignorance is not sufficient to accept or reject believing. And inventing some absurd, disingenuous belief, like the spaghetti monster, as an argument against having beliefs is simply being ridiculous and is a version of an appeal to a deliberate ignorance. The hard problem of consciousness is a similar issue. Is consciousness merely brain activity, or is there an immaterial soul that somehow indwells the brain? The question is unanswerable. If, as it turns out, consciousness is nothing more than brain activity, the fact of brain activity is not proof of it. That is simply an assumed equivocation. But if a soul indwells the brain, then brain activity might be nothing more than how the organism processes its attended consciousness in a manner that allows souls to sustain a connection to their bodies and to interact with one another through their biological animation. How can we determine which is which? I say we can't. In either case, the available evidence would appear to us identical. Am I a dualist or a monist? I am neither. I find the arguments for both interesting, but insufficient. To be honest, beliefs are psychologically involuntary. Everyone has beliefs, and those beliefs are most likely involving matters about which we are, to some degree, in ignorance. If you believe something or if you don't believe something, we can all entertain theories, but no one really knows why you do or do not believe any particular possibility. And every reason we give to judge each other or justify or debunk such beliefs is often a useless gesture, a total stab in the dark. The idea that beliefs are wrong is itself a self-contradicting belief. What about Occam's razor? Occam's razor is the scientific and philosophical rule that, given competing explanations or theories where one is complicated and the other simple, that we should prefer the more economic explanation. That is, simple is better than complicated when two competing ideas are proposed. This is a truly useful probability heuristic, but it is not a proof of anything. It can suggest that, given a history of just such conundrums, that reasonableness leans towards apparent simplicity. But with many questions where people appeal to Occam's razor, as it turns out, people differ on what strikes them as the more simple explanation. So, although Occam's razor has some genuine usefulness as a guideline when appealed to, it is an appeal to ignorance. Although science allegedly historically confirms simple hypotheses more often than complicated hypotheses, some scientific questions have turned out to be far more complicated than at first anticipated. So, Occam's razor is good for repeat gamblers and for scientists, but it cannot speak directly to the actual merits or demerits of a specific proposition. Occam's razor might be sufficient to raise one's eyebrows and warrant doubts, but it is not a legitimate strategy capable of settling any disagreement. appeal to pity. This one is going to be complicated because of human nature, class warfare, and other social inequities. Appeal to pity is a call to compassion that does not demonstrate the relevant connection to a premise, inference, or conclusion. It is basically a claim that someone is a victim in some potentially unrelated manner as the basis for accepting or rejecting the actuality of a problem or its proposed attending solution. And often this is done without proving someone is an unjust victim or demonstrating that even when they are a victim, that it is because of something related to the argument. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this man has huge medical debts and he is dying of cancer. His wife and children are devastated. How can you think such an unfortunate man could be guilty of perjury? Well, the dire straits of this man and his family has nothing to do with if he has committed perjury. Incarcerating a violent criminal will most likely do harm to them and their family, and so there is plenty of justification for reforming incarceration practices when possible. But this does not necessarily mean compassion requires us to reject every form of incarceration or sentencing that creates difficult consequences. And I say this as someone who has observed court proceedings and is unimpressed with the unworkably vindictive bias improperly dominating that process. I am unconvinced that the American criminal justice system is redemptive in ways it can and ought to be. There's no justification for a lack of compassion either, and very often a lack of compassion adds unnecessary harm to the otherwise justified need for necessary actions. Although I agree with some left-leaning concerns, I'm not a conservative either. Too often, the social justice warrior is reacting to real or imagined fragile victims and seeking to reduce the real or imagined harm without being open to the necessary processes wisely prerequisite to improving the situation. And it does not help at all that the social justice warrior is too often being opposed by insensitive scoundrels who lack empathy and compassion. So, this fallacy is not a criticism of compassion, nor is it a justification for creating victims, but it is to say that an appeal to compassion is an appeal to compassion, but it is not the basis for accepting a premise, inference, or conclusion. When various ideas and procedures can be demonstrated to be useful in righting a wrong, compassion can be appealed to when arguing for which workable idea is best. But compassion alone never makes an idea workable simply because we are moved to care. I think it is better to truly empathize because of unjustified complications that cause harm, while still requiring validity in embracing suggested solutions. Human rights activists, in my opinion, need to be careful to avoid relying too much on an appeal to pity as the basis for its activism. I'm not saying that pity or compassion should not be a strong part of their conversation, but in the end, people deserve human rights simply because they are human. Not because they feel bad, not because they are black or gay or trans or suffering or being some other form of actual victims. They deserve human rights because they're human, and also because discriminating against any human being for any reason that lacks practical relevance is unjustifiable, and I might add, unfortunately, culturally common. This gets more complicated because of human nature. Unfortunately, when it comes to a lack of empathy and a lack of compassion, an appeal to pity is often absolutely required in order to be effective. So, although this is technically a logical fallacy, it is still a powerful motivator. This is why I would say to the social justice warriors, come up with arguments for your reforms that have a compelling scientific logic, but then use an appeal to compassion to strongly motivate people lacking compassion to stop stalling. In the end, decisions need to be based on the merits of the outcome. And yes, compassion can be one of those merits as a meaningful part of the social environment. So this one is complicated because what makes an argument compelling and what compels us to act on an argument are two different undertakings, and both are essential to promote needed cultural changes. Consequently, rejecting the emotional call to act can be an equivocation fallacy for rejecting the valid reasons why action is still, nonetheless, sensible and truly needed. Argument from text or scripture. The notion that an academic or religious text is authoritative is a belief, perhaps a likely state of affairs, but still not a given fact. A text can include many truths, but that does not mean everything in it is true, nor is anything in any text true just because it is in a text. As an attending remark, it is interesting that an idea can be found in a text. Texts are an essential tool in the process of becoming educated, but textual quotes require their own substantive merits. This is another form of appeal to authority, but not all alleged authorities can be recognized as worthy of the honor just because their ideas appear in writing. Bandwagon. The bandwagon fallacy is an appeal to consensus or popularity of a trend. 4 out of 5 dentists recommend our toothpaste. Okay, maybe they do for scientific reasons, and maybe they don't. We need to know more. Consensus can be the result of bribes, or tribes, or general popularity. Maybe all those dentists also agree on other toothpastes as well. When people care about truth, which, by the way, is not safe to assume, it is more likely that trends will emerge, but trends emerge for numerous sociological reasons that can have no relevance to the truth of a matter. Even in science, Thomas Kuhn points out that scientific consensus can be political, and overcoming such bias among scientists, even in the face of significant evidence, often still requires that the old guard die off, allowing younger blood not yet invested in the old biased inclinations to reach a more scientific replacement to the old erroneous trend. The bandwagon can often improve the odds, but it is not an argument. As said before, an idea stands or falls on its own merits and nothing else. Cognitive dissonance versus cognitive consonance. This is rarely talked about, but both dissonance and consonance, when relied upon, can be fallacious. Cognitive dissonance is when deep inside you have this uncomfortable feeling that something is wrong with the idea you embrace. You might have no idea exactly what, or you have a pretty good idea what fails to jive. There is merely a sense that something is not quite right. You might be in denial of it and actively suppressing your feelings. You might fear the consequences of betraying those you are associated with, or fear the people you might become associated with if you give in to the feeling. Cognitive consonance is when you have pursued what seems like a sufficient effort to think something through. You're honestly unaware of anything that could remotely suggest your idea is in any manner erroneous, and so there is a calm sense of peace concerning the notion you adhere to. Cognitive dissonance and cognitive consonance our emotions. As we have said, ideas stand or fall on the merits or demerits of the idea itself, irrespective of your feelings. It is entirely possible that you are fighting off a dissonance even though the notion you have been embracing is indeed correct. And it is also entirely possible that you are incapable of appreciating the problems or honestly unaware of any fact that, if known, would render your idea problematic to you. It is absolutely important that we learn to be honest with ourselves, but we should not be hasty based on how we feel. The truth of a matter still lies entirely within the matter itself. Correlation or causal fallacy. This fallacy involves assuming a particular cause is the correct explanation for an apparent effect because it just seems painfully obvious. It may seem there is no need to demonstrate any actual cause and effect, nor does it seem we need to eliminate other possible explanations that could produce a high correlation. We need to slow down, because a high correlation between two data sets can happen for numerous reasons other than the apparent painfully obvious. First, we must understand that a statistical correlation means that two data sets appear to be strongly connected in some way. Exactly how they are connected is not possible to know based only on the fact that the two data sets are, indeed, statistically correlated. There are basically 6 reasons why two data sets might be highly correlated. The painfully obvious might be one of those 6 reasons. If it just seems likely that A causes B, it could very well turn out that this is actually the best explanation. But sometimes it is discovered that B actually causes A, much to our surprise, in spite of the fact that this is not the most common confirmation, and in spite of the opposite seeming to be painfully obvious. A third option is that A does not cause B, nor does B cause A, but rather a previously ignored data set C is found to be causing both A and causing B. For example, it might be observed that an increase over time in church attendance is highly correlated to increases in attendance at drinking establishments. Can we conclude that religion drives people to drink, or can we conclude that excessive drinking drives people to religion? Maybe these are both nothing more than the result of a growing population. Then there's also the possibility that the data sets A and B are simply coincidentally following a similar pattern, and there is no direct relationship of one to the other. The last home game of the Washington football team prior to the presidential election predicted the outcome of the election from 1936 to 2000. Margarine use can be correlated in some cities to the divorce rate. Coincidences are likely to happen when there are so many different data sets that can be cross-considered. Sometimes a high correlation implies absolutely nothing. Another common cause of high correlation is when two data sets are actually nothing more than two different ways of measuring and observing what amounts to be the same thing. Taller people tend to be heavier than shorter people. Yes, height and weight are not the same thing, but they are both a way of measuring the size of the exact same body. Neither necessarily causes the other. They just simply go closely, though not perfectly, hand in hand. A very strong correlation suggests just such an explanation. After all, you cannot grow taller by gaining weight. And some people who grow taller simply get skinnier and might not gain weight at all. However, when someone grows taller and becomes heavier, this is not cause and effect as much as it is a change in size showing up in more than one measurable way. Sometimes changes in A and changes in B can cause each other. People with high levels of anxiety may or may not also exhibit a higher heart rate. But as it turns out, anxiety can not only cause a higher heart rate, but a higher heart rate can also cause anxiety. They are connected, but not in just one exclusive cause and effect manner. This is also true of the physiological and psychological feedback loop behind panic attacks. And although this is not technically an additional cause of high correlation, it still needs to be considered that the cause of a high correlation might be the result of more than one contributing cause. It is possible that two highly correlated data sets do not directly affect each other, but there might be several other data sets that aggregate, not just one. Above, I mentioned that an increase in church attendance and an increase in attendance at drinking establishments can be caused by growth in the population. But it can also be affected by the weather or a pandemic. There might be no end to how many ways the different causes of correlation can combine to oppose or enhance an outcome. In a thorough investigation of statistical correlation, it is helpful if one can eliminate the various competing possible reasons for that high correlation before a compelling argument for a specific cause and effect relationship can be argued for. Correlation all by itself is merely interesting. Circular reasoning. You must obey the law because it is illegal to do otherwise. Everyone loves me because I am so popular. The Bible is the Word of God because the Bible, which is the Word of God, says so. Some have defined circular reasoning as making what amounts to a restatement of an assertion as if it somehow proves the assertion. If the end is contained in the assumed beginning, this is also circular reasoning, even if the beginning and the end are not the exact same assertion. Sometimes this is called stacking the deck. Equivocation. This is often a linguistic problem. Many words have more than one usage. Those uses might be related in some way or not related at all. Either way, not all the uses for that word are equivalent. So, if an argument relies upon what is actually true of one usage, it cannot be assumed that the same thing is true of every usage of that word. For example, I have the right to buy a new guitar. Therefore, it is right for me to buy it. My wife has never allowed me to get away with that argument. She knows, sad to say, that just because it is my right, and if it is the right thing to do, are not the same thing, even though both concepts use the exact same word. And just because in my youth I wanted to become a rock and roll star does not also mean I wanted to be a big ball of hot gas, having been called both notwithstanding. False dilemma. This is the idea a state of affairs will lead to only one of two possible outcomes. Often, this is where one outcome is to be dreaded. Therefore, you must make the correct choice to secure the better outcome, or you will be responsible for the only remaining possible bad outcome. Sometimes this is called the either-or fallacy, and simply refers to the idea that there are only two options, when in reality there could be several options or even several possible outcomes. It has also been called black and white thinking. These are all subtly different, but they are similar in their narrowed binary perspective. If you like my discussion on logical fallacies, you must donate to my Patreon page. Otherwise, you will be responsible for my serious financial problems. Well, as of this recording, I have not yet set up a Patreon page. Maybe I will get to that later, but you get the idea. You are simply not responsible for my financial situation, and changes to my finances do not depend on just you or just this decision. False dilemma is a common manipulation in politics. Voting for someone does not mean you agree with everything they stand for, nor does it mean that you disagree with everything their opponent stands for. The winner can falsely assume that their win is a rubber-stamped mandate on all their ideas. Furthermore, as a former parliamentarian, I can say that it is a perfectly legitimate reason to vote for something because you think it will fail, and this might be, as you see it, the best way to finally be done with it. Because most elections result in only one candidate winning in a contest where the only viable candidates are from one of two major parties, the false dilemma gives way to a concept creep, as if one candidate would be a disaster and the other a hero. Ranked choice voting, by the way, could help to reduce the sense of a false dilemma and open up the election's rhetoric, even if it remains likely that the winner will usually be from only one of the two major parties. Hasty generalization. This involves applying something that is true about someone or something as if it is true of everyone or everything in the category they are part of. It alleges that the whole is identical to a part in respect to something that is true of the part. This can happen either as the result of failing to look at the whole or relying on an unreliable sample size. If I were to tell you 3 out of 4 teenagers hate the Beatles, but I only asked 4 teenagers, that is obviously too small a sample size to conclude what the bulk of teenagers think about the Beatles. A man who has had a bad relationship with a redhead female might now keep talking as if any female with red hair is fickle. Limited exposure to a general class can seduce us into making conclusions about the entire class, especially if we disagree with them. In politics and news coverage, this is all too common. Just because some protesters have resorted to violence does not mean all protesters are violent, or that the majority of people sympathetic to a particular cause are people who approve of violent methods. Peaceful protests rarely get news coverage, and so violent protests can give protests an undeserved negativity and might not be significantly representative of a particular protest movement. In the end, the truths about a cause have nothing to do with the real or alleged generalizations that we have been made aware of. For example, Black Lives Matter means something very genuine to many, and something involving inappropriate behaviors to a small minority of understandably exasperated people. Dismissing the movement because you have a need to deny racism is simply being dishonest about the demonstrable dynamics going on in disenfranchised black communities. Red herring. This is more than just changing the subject, which is evasive, but not necessarily a red herring. A red herring is the use of an alleged related issue that distractingly changes the subject while pretending to be directly relevant. Politicians excel at this. They receive a critical question and respond by being not only vague, but bringing up something else they believe puts them or their issue in a better light, and try to spin it as if their response is directly related to the original issue. If you call them on the red herring, they are likely to argue for the strong connection. They will most likely never admit to having resorted to this fallacy. Slippery slope. This is an unproven claim that an idea or action will definitely lead to a series of events leading to a definite outcome. Opposing any form of gun control because it allegedly will lead to them taking away all our guns is a slippery slope argument. Sadly, a very persuasive one. This is similar to the false dilemma, except that the alleged inevitability need not be something dreadful. The key element is that it is claimed that by taking the first step, it will inevitably lead to numerous additional steps that will be quite impossible to avoid. If you forgive them, they will only do it again. If you ever resort to comforting your baby when it cries, it will expect you to comfort it every time and throw a fit if you don't. Before long, that baby will end up in prison. Now, this is not to say that there are not sensible considerations about where certain choices could lead, but it does not justify refusing to do anything that even looks like the first step in the direction of a miserable outcome. Good outcomes and bad outcomes can often share similar or even identical steps. Straw man argument. This is a form of either deliberate dishonesty or truly distorted thinking. It begins by misrepresenting an idea or stating an unproven associated idea, and then arguing as if attacking the inaccurate misrepresentation or the alleged associated idea is a sufficient argument against the actual original idea. Basically, the argument opposed is converted from what it actually represents into a fictional form, and then the fictional form gets debunked as if we have successfully debunked the original idea. The straw man argument might even be true about the associated idea, but it is not necessarily true of the original idea. For example, one person fears that Medicare for all is too expensive and that we cannot afford it. It is a straw man argument to respond with, obviously you do not care if people die from a lack of proper health care. If you really cared about people, you would support the cost of universal health care. Now, it may be true that they really don't care, but it still does not address the issue of if we can afford Medicare for all. A proper response would require showing how Medicare for all could save money, or, if more costly, was still well within our means and worth the increased cost. Sunk costs. This is a sad dynamic. Even when correctly explained, some people just do not see it clearly. It involves assuming you must continue on a course of action because you have much invested in spite of no assurance of an eventual payoff. Basically, it is continuing on a failed path because we are in too deep to quit now. Now, it may be true that a high cost, be it money or time or something else of value, may have already been committed and unrecoverable. However, the decision to quit or to move forward must still be based on if the goal is reachable without regard to if the costs already lost can ever be recovered. The costs already lost are gone, and nothing will bring them back. Nonetheless, moving forward still requires a decision about outcomes from here on out. Continuing on might still be the best choice in spite of the regretted previous costs. It is even possible that quitting could result in an even deeper loss and that there will never be a positive payoff. A minimized loss is still better than a grossly huge loss. However, remaining steadfast in an endeavor is a bad idea when a totally different venture shows far more promise. Accept your losses, abandon the project, and move on to something else. Either way, the previous cost is no longer relevant when it comes to deciding how to best move forward after a deep investment. Not to say we should not learn from the mistakes made, but the best course of action depends entirely on the outcomes as compared to where we are now. Tu quoque. Besides being often mispronounced, tu quoque involves avoiding an argument by pointing out hypocrisy in the arguer, or accusing the arguer of being disingenuous in living up to their claim. It may be true that they are indeed a hypocrite, but their hypocrisy does not thereby invalidate their assertion. Perhaps this could include whataboutism. In political discussions, a criticism is on offer about a particular candidate, to which the candidate's supporters rejoin with, "Oh yeah? What about fill in the blank?" And then go on to mention some alleged hypocrisy in their opponent. Given the current political climate these days, it may very well be that the majority of politicians in all parties are hypocrites. This still has no bearing on if their proposed positions are good or bad ideas. As has been said repeatedly, ideas stand or fall on their own merits or demerits, not on the alleged merits or demerits of the person putting those ideas on offer. This is perhaps another form of the ad hominem that we started with. I suspect hypocrites occasionally latch on to a truly meaningful cause as a way of trying to improve their image. Even so, the hypocrisy has nothing to do with the merits of the position. In conclusion, keep in mind that when someone makes use of a logical fallacy, it is also a logical fallacy to think this somehow invalidates the truth of their assertion. It only invalidates their argument. We could say this is the logical fallacy. Things can still be true, but just for reasons other than those on offer. Things asserted can be true even though the assertion is a lucky, uneducated guess. So the detection of a logical fallacy only means that the argument is in bad form and requires improvement, if possible. It does not necessarily mean the assertion is thereby false. As has been said by many, there is nothing I dislike more than a bad argument for something I hold dear. The naive followers are often doing this. All logical fallacies are a departure from what speaks to the merits or demerits of an issue. Therefore, the truth of a matter remains irrespective of if a logical fallacy has been resorted to. There is an old proverb that says, "As iron sharpens iron, so one man another." Working out clear thinking is not a solo effort. It really requires allowing yourself to be confronted by those who do not agree with you. Isolating yourself to hang out only with your own ideological in-group, regardless of what ideas belong to that group, always creates lazy thinking. Thanks for listening. I'm Bob Greaves, and this has been Living with Wisdom.